Most people don't suffer because life is hard. They suffer because they are fighting the wrong battle in their own mind. The very first discipline Stoicism teaches, before tactics, before resilience, before emotional control, is learning how to separate what is truly under your control from what never was. Until you master this distinction, no amount of motivation, confidence, or intelligence will save you from emotional exhaustion. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The human mind is wired to try to control everything. Outcomes, other people's reactions, the past, the future, reputation, recognition. And every time the mind reaches for something it cannot command, it creates frustration. Frustration turns into anger. Anger turns into anxiety. Anxiety turns into emotional weakness. Not because you are fragile, but because you are misdirecting your effort. The Stoics understood something modern psychology now confirms. Emotional disturbance is not caused by events themselves, but by our interpretation of them. Epictetus made this painfully clear when he said that people are disturbed not by things but by the views they take of them. What he was really saying is this: reality doesn't break you, your expectations do. Think about how often your emotions spike because someone didn't act the way you wanted, because a plan didn't work out, because life didn't follow the script in your head. In those moments, your mind isn't reacting to reality. It's reacting to the loss of an illusion of control. Stoicism cuts through that illusion with precision. It draws a hard line. On one side are your thoughts, your judgments, your values, your effort, your discipline, your response. On the other side is everything else: outcomes, other people, luck, timing, the past, the opinions of the crowd. The mistake most people make is trying to dominate the second category while neglecting the first. A strong mind doesn't waste energy where it has no authority. This is where emotional strength actually begins, not by suppressing emotion, but by redirecting attention. When something happens that triggers you, the Stoic question is not "why did this happen to me?" It's "what part of this is mine to handle?" That question alone is a psychological weapon. It immediately pulls you out of victimhood and into agency. If someone insults you, you don't control their mouth. If a plan fails, you don't control the past. If the world changes overnight, you don't control reality. But you always control how you interpret, respond, and adapt. And once you accept that fully, not intellectually but emotionally, your mind stops panicking because it finally knows where its power actually lives. This is not passive thinking. It's strategic thinking. Modern cognitive psychology calls this locus of control. People with an internal locus of control, those who believe their actions matter, are more resilient, less anxious, and emotionally stable. Stoicism arrived at the same conclusion 2,000 years earlier without brain scans or clinical trials. They trained the mind to stay inside its jurisdiction. And here's the paradox: the moment you stop trying to control everything, you actually become more effective. You make better decisions. You respond instead of react. You conserve energy. Emotional chaos thrives in confusion. Emotional strength thrives in clarity. But clarity requires honesty. You have to admit how much emotional pain comes from arguing with reality, from replaying the past, from rehearsing imaginary futures, from needing other people to validate your worth. None of that is under your control, and every time your mind chases it, it loses stability. Stoicism doesn't tell you to be indifferent. It tells you to be precise. Care deeply about your character. Care deeply about your actions. Care deeply about your standards. Be ruthless about letting go of everything else. This is why the Stoics practiced mental exercises daily. They rehearsed loss, failure, and discomfort in their imagination, not to be pessimistic, but to remind the mind what it could survive and what it didn't need to fear. When you expect volatility, emotions lose their grip. Surprise is one of the strongest emotional triggers. Preparation dissolves it. And this mindset doesn't make you cold. It makes you stable. Stability is what allows compassion without weakness, ambition without anxiety, confidence without arrogance. You stop demanding that life cooperate with your emotions, and you start commanding your own behavior regardless of conditions. This foundation is critical because everything else builds on it. You cannot observe emotions without obeying them if you still believe they control you. You cannot develop discipline if your mood dictates your effort. You cannot reframe pain if you see yourself as powerless. Control is the root. Not control over life, but control over the self. When you finally accept that your mind is not responsible for managing the world, only for managing itself, something shifts. The noise quiets, the urgency fades, decisions become cleaner. Emotions still arise, but they no longer dominate. And that is the real beginning of mental strength. Control what is yours, release what is not. Everything else is emotional noise. Once you understand what is and isn't under your control, the next level of training begins. And this is where most people fail, not because they lack willpower, but because they misunderstand the role of emotion itself. They believe emotional strength means suppressing feelings, shutting them down, or pretending they don't exist. Stoicism teaches the opposite. Real strength comes from learning how to observe emotions without obeying in them. Here's the reality: you cannot stop emotions from arising. Fear, anger, desire, jealousy, frustration, these are automatic responses wired into the nervous system. They emerge before logic has a chance to speak. Anyone who tells you they are emotionless is either lying or dangerously unaware. The Stoic goal was never to eliminate emotion, it was to strip emotion of authority. Think of emotions as internal weather. Storms form whether you like it or not. But a trained mind doesn't run into the storm and start negotiating with the wind. It watches, it measures, it waits. Observation creates distance, and distance creates choice. This idea shows up clearly in both Stoicism and modern psychology. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most effective psychological frameworks we have, is built on a simple insight. Thoughts and emotions are events in the mind, not commands. You can notice them without becoming them. The Stoics practiced this long before it had a clinical name. When an emotion hits, most people collapse into it instantly. Anger becomes shouting, anxiety becomes avoidance, desire becomes impulsive action. There is no pause, no buffer. The emotion speaks, and the body obeys. Over time, this conditions the mind to believe emotions are in charge. That belief is the real problem. The Stoic response is radically different. When an emotion arises, the first move is awareness. Not judgment, not resistance. Awareness. I feel anger, I notice fear, frustration present. This may sound simple, almost too simple, but it's a psychological interrupt. The moment you name the emotion, you step out of it. You shift from being inside the emotion to standing over it. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about this practice. He reminded himself constantly that emotions are impressions, not truths. They knock on the door of the mind, but you choose whether to invite them in, question them, or let them pass. That pause, sometimes only a few seconds long, is where emotional mastery lives. And let's be clear, observing an emotion does not mean invalidating it. Emotions often contain information. Fear may be signaling risk. Anger may be signaling a boundary violation. Sadness may be signaling loss. But information does not equal instruction. Just because an alarm goes off doesn't mean the building is on fire. You check first. This is where discipline replaces impulse. A strong mind asks, what is this emotion trying to tell me? And then follows with, what response aligns with my values? Not what feels good. Not what relieves tension fastest. What is correct? This practice rewires you over time. Each time you feel an emotion and choose not to act immediately, you weaken the emotional reflex loop. The mind learns that emotions can exist without action. That alone reduces their intensity. Neuroscience backs this up. Emotions lose power when they are observed without reinforcement. Reaction feeds them. Awareness starves them. This is why emotional regulation is not about force. It's about patience. When you stop fighting emotions and start watching them, they rise, peak, and fall naturally. Most emotions, if not acted on, dissolve on their own. But if you react, if you argue, explode, escape, or indulge, you extend their lifespan. This is also why people feel out of control emotionally. They've trained themselves to react. The mind does what it's practiced. Stoicism reverses that conditioning through repetition. Over and over again, you notice, you pause, you choose. And this doesn't make you passive or weak. It makes you precise, dangerous even. Because when others are ruled by emotional urgency, you remain calm. When others escalate, you de-escalate. When others chase relief, you choose strategy. Emotional detachment is not apathy, it's leverage. There's another layer here that's critical. When you identify too closely with your emotions, criticism feels like an attack on your identity. Failure feels like a verdict on your worth. But when emotions are seen as temporary states rather than definitions of self, your identity stabilizes. You stop saying I'm angry and start saying anger is present. That shift alone creates psychological armor. This practice also prepares you for pain. Painful emotions don't disappear, but they lose their ability to dominate. You suffer less, not because life is easier, but because you're no longer amplifying every sensation with panic and resistance. And this is what everything connects. You can't build discipline if emotions dictate action. You can't reframe pain if emotions control interpretation. You can't choose long-term strength if short-term feelings run the show. Observation is the gatekeeper skill. Without it, the rest collapses. So the goal is not to be calm all the time. That's unrealistic. The goal is to remain sovereign even when emotions are loud, to let them speak without letting them rule. Feel everything. Obey nothing blindly. Once you can distinguish control from illusion, and once you can observe emotions without being dragged by them, the next truth becomes unavoidable. Mental strength is not a personality trait. It's a trained capacity. And like any capacity, it grows only through disciplined, repeated effort. This is where Stoicism separates philosophy from fantasy. It was never meant to be read once and admired. It was meant to be practiced daily, under pressure, in ordinary moments where comfort tempts you to quit. Most people wait for motivation. Stoics train discipline so they wouldn't need it. Discipline, in this context, isn't punishment or harshness. It's structure. It's the intentional shaping of behavior so that the mind learns to act correctly even when emotions resist. From a psychological standpoint, this is habit formation. From a philosophical standpoint, it's character formation. And the Stoics understood that character is nothing more than the sum of what you repeatedly do when no one is watching. The modern mind wants transformation without friction, a new mindset without inconvenience. Stoicism rejects that completely. It assumes resistance is necessary. In fact, it uses resistance as the training ground. That's why Stoics practiced voluntary discomfort, cold exposure, fasting, physical labor, silence, simplicity. Not because suffering is noble, but because comfort weakens the mind's tolerance for adversity. Seneca wrote about deliberately living with less from time to time, wearing plain clothes, eating basic food, sleeping without luxury, then asking himself, is this what I feared? The exercise wasn't about deprivation. It was about recalibrating fear. When the mind learns it can function without constant comfort, emotional dependence collapses. Psychologically, this works because the nervous system adapts. What once felt unbearable becomes manageable. What once triggered anxiety becomes familiar. Discipline slowly expands your emotional bandwidth. You can hold discomfort without panicking. You can delay relief without feeling deprived. That is real power. But discipline isn't just about physical discomfort. It's about mental consistency. The Stoics were relentless about reflection, morning intention, evening review, asking what will challenge me today, and later, where did I fail to act according to my values? This wasn't self-criticism, it was self-calibration. You don't shame the mind into strength, you train it through honest feedback. Most people avoid reflection because it exposes inconsistency. Stoics embraced it because it eliminated self-deception. And self-deception is the enemy of discipline. You cannot train what you refuse to see. This is where modern psychology aligns again. Behavioral change doesn't happen through insight alone. It happens through feedback loops. Cue, response, consequence. Stoic discipline engineered these loops intentionally. You anticipate challenges. You choose responses. You review outcomes. Over time, correct responses become automatic. Emotional discipline stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like default behavior. This is why discipline eventually feels like freedom. At first, it feels restrictive. You say no to impulses, you delay gratification, you hold standards when it would be easier to relax them. But over time, the emotional chaos that once controlled you loses leverage. You're no longer negotiating with every feeling. You already know what you do and what you don't. There's another layer most people miss. Discipline is how you build trust with yourself. Every time you follow through despite resistance, you reinforce a powerful internal signal. I do what I decide. That signal stabilizes identity. Confidence stops being emotional and becomes structural. You don't feel strong, you know you're reliable. Without discipline, the mind fractures. One part makes promises, another part breaks them. That internal inconsistency breeds guilt, anxiety, and self-doubt. Stoicism repairs that fracture by aligning intention and action through repetition. You become psychologically whole. And discipline doesn't require extreme routines or dramatic gestures. It starts small. Getting up when you said you would. Ending conversations you know are draining. Doing the difficult task before the easy one. Speaking honestly when silence would be safer. These are micro-trainings. Each one strengthens the same muscle, self-command. Over time, emotions adjust. They stop flaring as often because they no longer control outcomes. Frustration fades because effort replaces complaint. Fear shrinks because action replaces avoidance. Desire becomes manageable because patience replaces impulse. This is the quiet genius of Stoic discipline. It doesn't fight emotion directly. It renders emotion irrelevant through structure. And this is what makes the rest of the philosophy possible. You cannot reframe pain if you haven't practiced discomfort. You cannot detach from validation if you haven't practiced self-denial. You cannot choose long-term strength if you haven't trained short-term restraint. Discipline is the bridge between understanding and embodiment. The mind does not rise to inspiration. It falls to its training. Train it daily, or it will obey whatever feels strongest in the moment. Once discipline becomes part of your daily structure, something subtle but powerful starts to happen. The events that once felt like personal attacks begin to look different. Setbacks don't disappear, but they stop feeling meaningless. This is where Stoicism makes one of its most demanding moves. It asks you to stop seeing pain as punishment and start seeing it as training. Most people don't break because of pain itself. They break because of the story they attach to it. This shouldn't be happening. This isn't fair. This means I'm failing. That internal narrative multiplies suffering. Pain plus interpretation becomes emotional collapse. The Stoics aim directly at that interpretation. They understood that adversity is not random chaos. It is the raw material of character. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that what stands in the way becomes the way, not because obstacles are pleasant, but because resistance reveals what you are made of. Without resistance, strength has nowhere to grow. From a psychological perspective, this aligns with what we now call cognitive reframing. The meaning you assign to an experience shapes your emotional response to it. Two people can endure the same hardship and emerge completely different, one bitter, one stronger. The difference is not the event, it's the frame. Stoicism trains you to adopt a frame that produces resilience rather than resentment. When something painful happens, the Stoic question is not why me? It's what is this here to train? Patience, courage, self-control, humility. Every hardship tests something specific. If you can identify the test, the suffering becomes purposeful. This does not mean denying pain. Stoics never pretended pain didn't hurt. Seneca openly acknowledged grief, illness, loss, and fear. The discipline was not numbness. It was refusal to add mental suffering on top of physical or emotional pain. You feel the pain, but you don't dramatize it. You don't inflate it with catastrophizing thoughts. You keep it proportional. Modern neuroscience supports this. When you label pain as intolerable or unjust, the brain's threat systems intensify, stress hormones increase, emotional reactivity spikes. But when pain is framed as manageable and meaningful, the brain shifts into problem-solving mode. The same pain, experienced differently. This is why Stoics practice negative visualization. They would imagine loss, failure, illness, not to dwell on misery, but to reduce shock when adversity arrived. When you expect difficulty, you don't interpret it as betrayal. You interpret it as confirmation. This is what training feels like, and this mindset changes behavior immediately. Instead of avoiding discomfort, you engage it. Instead of collapsing under pressure, you lean into it. Pain becomes a signal to apply discipline, not a reason to abandon it. There's a deeper layer here that most people avoid. Pain exposes attachment. When something hurts intensely, it's often because you were clinging to a specific outcome, identity, or expectation. Stoicism uses pain as feedback. It asks, what am I attached to that I don't control? That question dissolves unnecessary offering. Loss hurts less when you accept impermanence. Failure hurts less when you separate effort from outcome. Rejection hurts less when you detach worth from approval. Pain becomes instructive instead of destructive. This is also where emotional strength becomes visible to others. When people see you absorb pressure without bitterness, they notice, not because you're emotionless, but because you're unshaken. That stability is rare. It creates trust, it creates authority, it creates influence. But this takes practice. Reframing pain is not a one-time insight. It's a repeated mental action. Every time discomfort appears, you choose the frame: training or punishment, opportunity or injustice, growth or grievance. The choice determines whether pain sharpens you or corrodes you. And let's be honest, this is not easy. There will be moments when pain overwhelms your philosophy, when emotions surge faster than reason. Stoicism doesn't condemn that. It prepares you to recover faster, to return to center, to remind yourself again and again that adversity is part of the process, not evidence of failure. This is why the previous disciplines matter. Without control of attention, pain hijacks the mind. Without emotional observation, pain dictates behavior. Without discipline, pain becomes an excuse. Stoicism integrates all of it into a single posture: meet hardship head-on, extract its lesson, move forward stronger. Over time, something profound happens. You stop fearing pain. Not because you enjoy it, but because you trust your ability to endure and learn from it. Fear loses leverage. Anxiety loses urgency. Life becomes less threatening because nothing feels wasted. And that changes everything. You take risks. You speak honestly. You attempt difficult things. You stop shrinking to protect comfort. Pain will come regardless. The only question is whether it will break you or build you. Train it to build you. As you learn to endure pain without letting it define you, another source of emotional instability becomes impossible to ignore. It's quieter than fear and more socially acceptable than anger, but it controls more people than either. The need for external validation, approval, recognition, status, praise. These things seem harmless, even motivating. In reality, they are some of the strongest emotional levers that exist. The Stoics understood that the fastest way to lose control of your inner world is to hand it over to the opinions of others. Most emotional reactions are not about events themselves, but about how those events affect our image. Insults hurt because they threaten identity. Failure stings because it risks judgment. Success feels good because it signals acceptance. When your emotional state depends on how you are perceived, your mind becomes reactive by default. You are always adjusting, performing, defending. Stoicism draws a hard boundary here. Reputation is external, praise is external, criticism is external. You can influence them, but you cannot command them. And anything you cannot command cannot be allowed to govern your emotions. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself repeatedly that the opinions of others are just vibrations in the air, sounds that pass through the ears and vanish. What gives them power is not their volume, but your agreement. The moment you internalize judgment, you give it authority over your nervous system. Modern psychology describes this as contingent self-worth. When your sense of value is tied to performance or approval, emotional stability becomes impossible. You rise with praise. You crash with criticism. You live on a psychological roller coaster, constantly scanning for signals of acceptance or rejection. The Stoic solution is not arrogance or isolation, it is internal anchoring. You shift the source of worth from external reaction to internal standards. Instead of asking, "Do they approve?" you ask, "Did I act according to my values?" That single shift removes enormous emotional volatility. This doesn't mean you ignore feedback. Feedback can be useful, but usefulness and emotional dependence are not the same. You evaluate criticism rationally, not defensively. You accept what helps. You discard what doesn't. Praise becomes pleasant, not necessary. Criticism becomes data, not a verdict. This is why Stoics emphasize virtue over reputation. Virtue, wisdom, courage, justice, self-control, exists entirely within your control. Reputation does not. When you build identity around virtue, your emotional center becomes stable. No one can take it from you. No one can grant it to you. That independence is psychological freedom. There's a deeper consequence here that most people miss. When you detach from validation, your behavior becomes cleaner. You stop posturing. You stop exaggerating. You stop making decisions to be seen rather than to be correct. Integrity becomes easier because you're no longer negotiating with an imaginary audience. This also changes how you handle social pressure. The fear of standing out, being disliked, or being misunderstood weakens. You speak more honestly. You tolerate discomfort in conversations. You can hold unpopular positions without emotional collapse. That ability alone separates leaders from followers. Stoicism also warns against the subtle addiction of praise. Praise feels good because it confirms belonging. But when you chase it, you train the mind to need it. Over time, the absence of validation feels like rejection, even when none exists. Emotional dependency grows quietly. By practicing detachment, you reverse that dependency. You learn to generate internal approval through self-respect. When you know you acted well, the mind settles. You don't need applause, you don't need reassurance. You become internally regulated rather than socially regulated. This is especially relevant in a world driven by visibility. Likes, comments, metrics, public opinion. These systems reward emotional reactivity. Stoicism is a counterweight. It teaches you to step out of the crowd mentally, even while operating within it. And this doesn't make you cold or indifferent. It makes your relationships healthier. When you're not seeking validation, you listen better. You give without keeping score. You don't manipulate for approval. You don't collapse under disapproval. Emotional clarity replaces emotional bargaining. There will still be moments when judgment stings. Stoics didn't deny that. But they trained themselves to recover quickly, to remind themselves this does not touch my character unless I allow it to. That reminder is powerful. It puts the mind back in its proper role, self-governing rather than crowd-governed. And this discipline connects directly to the next stages of mental strength. You cannot master your inner dialogue if you are outsourcing worth. You cannot choose long-term integrity if you are chasing short-term approval. Detachment is not with Roal. It is sovereignty. When you no longer need to be seen, you become impossible to control. Respect yourself first, everything else is noise. When external validation no longer controls you, something else becomes impossible to ignore. The voice that remains, the one that speaks when no one else is around, the one that narrates failure, interprets pain, predicts the future, and assigns meaning to everything you experience. This is where real control either solidifies or collapses. Because even if you detach from the opinions of the world, you are still living with your own internal dialogue, and most people are at war with it. Stoicism understood something brutal and precise. Your inner voice is not neutral. It is either trained or it is reckless. Left untrained, it exaggerates threats, dramatizes setbacks, and turns temporary emotions into permanent identities. A single failure becomes I always fail. A moment of fear becomes I'm weak. A setback becomes this is who I am now. That voice doesn't describe reality. It manufactures it. The Stoics treated this voice like a weapon that needed discipline. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations not for the public but for himself. They were reminders, corrections, recalibrations. He wasn't journaling feelings, he was issuing commands. Over and over he challenged his own interpretations. Is this necessary? Is this within my control? Why am I disturbed by this? He understood that thoughts left unchecked become belief. And beliefs become behavior. Modern psychology confirms this directly. The thoughts you repeat most often become cognitive defaults. The brain reinforces what it hears consistently. If your inner dialogue is hostile, catastrophic, or self-defeating, your nervous system will respond as if you are under constant threat. Anxiety, anger, and depression are often not caused by reality, but by relentless internal narration. Stoicism intervenes at the source. The first move is recognizing that thoughts are not facts. They are propositions, hypotheses, suggestions. The mind throws them out constantly, and most of them are distorted. When something goes wrong, the untrained mind jumps to conclusions, worst-case scenarios, personal attacks, permanent damage. The Stoic response is interrogation. Is this true? Is this useful? Is this within my control? If the answer is no, the thought is dismissed. Not suppressed, dismissed. There's a critical difference. Suppression creates resistance, and resistance strengthens thoughts. Dismissal deprives them of attention. Attention is oxygen. Without it, thoughts fade. This is why Stoic self-talk is firm but rational. It doesn't insult the self, and it doesn't indulge it. It speaks in facts, not fantasies. Instead of this is unbearable, it says, this is uncomfortable but manageable. Instead of I can't handle this, it says I've handled worse. These are not affirmations, they are corrections, and corrections change behavior. When your inner voice is calm and precise, emotions lose their ability to escalate. Fear still arises, but it doesn't spiral. Anger still appears, but it doesn't hijack. Doubt still whispers, but it doesn't paralyze. You create an internal authority that emotions must answer to. This is why Stoicism emphasizes reason over impulse, not cold logic, but clear thinking. Reason doesn't deny emotion, it contextualizes it. It keeps emotion proportional. It prevents temporary states from turning into permanent identities. Most people don't realize how often they talk themselves into weakness. They rehearse defeat. They narrate limitations. They describe themselves in ways they would never describe someone they respect. Stoicism demands a higher standard. You speak to yourself as someone responsible for command. This doesn't mean kindness replaces honesty. Stoic self-talk can be severe, but it is never chaotic. It never says you are worthless. It says you acted poorly. Correct it. It never says this is hopeless. It says this is difficult. Adjust. The difference is everything. Over time, this practice reshapes identity. You stop being the person who reacts internally and start being the one who responds internally. That distinction is subtle, but it's the difference between being ruled and being sovereign, and this practice requires repetition. Thoughts move fast, old patterns return under stress. Stoicism doesn't promise permanent control, it promises recoverability. You notice the distortion sooner, you interrupt it faster, you return to center more reliably. That's strength. This mastery of inner dialogue is what stabilizes everything else. Discipline becomes sustainable because you're not constantly negotiating with yourself. Pain becomes tolerable because it's not amplified by catastrophic thinking. Detachment from validation holds because you're not seeking reassurance internally either. Eventually, the mind grows quieter, not because it has nothing to say, but because it has learned restraint. Silence replaces mental noise, clarity replaces chaos, and in that clarity, decisions sharpen. Your thoughts are not innocent. Train them, or they will train you. The mind is no longer hijacked by emotion, no longer dependent on validation, and no longer sabotaged by its own inner dialogue. The final test appears. This is where everything you've trained for either holds or collapses. The test is simple but brutal. Will you choose long-term strength over short-term relief? Every emotional impulse promises relief. Say, why the thing? Quit the task. Escape the discomfort. Indulge the urge. Avoid the confrontation. These impulses are not evil. They are biological. The nervous system is designed to reduce pain as quickly as possible. But what reduces pain now often creates weakness later. Stoicism exists to interrupt that trade. The Stoics were clear about this. The greatest threat to character is not suffering, but softness. Not pain, but avoidance. When you consistently choose immediate relief, you train the mind to fear discomfort, and fear, once learned, spreads. Modern psychology calls this avoidance conditioning. Each time you escape discomfort, the brain learns that discomfort is dangerous. Anxiety grows, tolerance shrinks, emotional reactivity increases. Stoicism counters this by deliberately choosing the harder path, not recklessly, but intentionally. Delayed gratification is not about denial for its own sake. It's about authority. When you can feel an urge and still choose against it, you reinforce a core truth. Emotions do not decide behavior. You do. This choice appears in ordinary moments. Getting up when staying in bed feels better. Speaking honestly when silence feels safer. Continuing effort when quitting would feel relieving. These are not dramatic acts, but repeated daily, they reshape identity. Stoics trained this deliberately. They reminded themselves that comfort is seductive and dangerous. Seneca warned that a life devoted to pleasure becomes fragile. Not because pleasure is wrong, but because dependence is. When comfort becomes necessary, discomfort becomes intolerable. This is why Stoicism frames virtue as a long-term investment. You don't act courageously because it feels good. It often doesn't. You act courageously because it builds something stable inside you. You don't practice restraint because it's pleasant. You practice it because it preserves freedom. And freedom here doesn't mean doing whatever you want. It means not being enslaved by what you want. There's a psychological shift that happens when you consistently choose long-term strength. Your relationship with time changes. You stop living from urge to urge. You start living from principle to principle. Decisions become easier because you already know the answer. You don't negotiate with impulses, you override them. This also changes how you experience emotions. Short-term relief loses its appeal because you felt the cost too many times. Regret, weakness, self-distrust. Meanwhile, the quiet satisfaction of endurance becomes familiar. You may not feel pleasure in the moment, but you feel respect afterward. And respect lasts. Stoicism also teaches that pleasure and pain are unreliable guides. They fluctuate, they exaggerate, they lie. What feels unbearable now is often trivial in hindsight. What feels irresistible now often feels embarrassing later. Long-term thinking cuts through that distortion. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly that everything passes, urges included. If you can hold for a moment, the urge weakens. If you act immediately, you strengthen it. Time is an ally when you don't rush to escape sensation. This is why emotional strength is inseparable from patience. Not passive waiting, but active endurance. You stay with discomfort long enough to realize it cannot command you. That realization is transformative. And this final discipline ties everything together. You cannot delay gratification if you haven't learned to observe emotion. You cannot endure discomfort if you haven't reframed pain. You cannot act from principle if you haven't detached from validation. Stoicism is not a collection of techniques. It's a system. When practiced fully, something changes at a deep level. You stop asking, how do I feel about this? And start asking, who do I choose to be here? That question bypasses emotion entirely. It places identity above sensation. And that is the ultimate training of the mind. Life will always offer the easy way out, the shortcut, the excuse, the relief. Stoicism teaches you to recognize those offers for what they are, trades that cost more than they give. Choose strength today so you don't have to beg for it tomorrow. Comfort fades. Character compounds.